So we are beginning a new book of the Torah, the fourth book of the Chumash, the book of Bamidbar, which in English is known as Numbers, and in the classic terminology of the sages, it's called Chumash HaPukudim, which means numbers. And it starts with numbers, and there are a lot of numbers in it, especially the numbers of the Jewish people. So that is how the Sedra and the book of Bamidbar begin. So let's start at the beginning, and we will observe at the outset that the main theme of the whole Sedra is the census of the Jewish people. And we'll discuss the purpose of the census and some of the features of the census in our shir tonight with our friend for the year, Don Isaac Abravanel. So it's on page 726, if you're with me in the Stone Chumash. וידבר אדוני אל משה במדבר סיני באוהל מועד באחד החודש השני בשנה השנית לצאתם ארץ מצרים לאמור. Hashem spoke to Moshe, and perhaps in order to orient the reader, because this is the beginning of the new book of the Torah, we have more information than we would generally find with that formula that Hashem spoke to Moshe saying. So here we have the fact it was in the Sinai wilderness, it was in the Ohel Moed, is the tent of appointed meeting, which is the Mishkan, which has now been built already in the book of Exodus, and we learned a lot about it in Vayikra as well. So naturally, having narrated the giving of the Torah, Moshe's sojourn on Har Sinai, now the locus of the divine communication is no longer on Mount Sinai, but through the medium or through the location, the locus, as I said, of that's locust, not locust, the insect, but the space, the location is Ohel Moed, and that's what the Torah says here. And the Torah tells us when it was on the first of the month of the second, the first of the month of the second, the first day of the second month of the second year of their departure from Mitzrayim. Now, the reason I draw attention to that is that the Torah says, Suas Rosh Kaladas Ben Israel, lift up the heads, which is an expression of counting. Take a census of all of the children of Israel. And the Torah describes in some detail who are the ones to take the census, the Nesiim, the princes of each tribe. And the Torah goes on to tell us how many were in each tribe. And it's a bit technical in nature. It gives us some of the names, as we said, of the princes of each tribe and the census that was undertaken of each tribe. And then we have more about the positioning of the tribes within the encampment, who was in the south, who was in the east, etc. And we have the insignias. We have also the special role of the Leviim, which we already have learned about, and we learn more about it here. The fact that the Leviim are encamped around the Mishkan in the center of the wider encampment of the Jewish people. And then towards the end of the Sedra, we have some details about the tribe of Levi. So I want to consider a question which concerns Abarbanel, and it would concern, I think, anyone who reads the Torah. I was going to say carefully, even if you don't read it carefully, even if you just consider the classic number that we associate with the total sort of census of the Jewish people, you know there are 600,000. The Torah mentions that term 600,000 when the Jewish people first left Mitzrayim. We have that amount 603,550 at the time of the original prior census, which was in the first year. And now this is the second year. It's near the beginning of the second year. And the Torah says, take another census. And you know what? Firstly, we don't know why there is the need for a further census. But furthermore, the surprising thing is that the census has the same numbers, even though the tribes, the numbers within each tribe are not identical, but the overall number is the same. And we have to wonder what's the purpose of it. So Rashi, meaning, besides what's the purpose of it, well, how can it be? Now, it's not that the Jewish people did not increase in number at all in the course of the year. Remember, any population of hundreds of thousands of men, of women, of all different ages, you're going to expect some of the women who are pregnant to give birth and some to become pregnant and give birth within that year. But the census does not count from the day of birth. The census is only from the age of 20 and upward, which means that in the prior census, someone who is 19 years old is not included. I have to say it's only men who are in this census. Okay, perhaps this is in the uh, feminist era, and okay, the census was for men. Fair enough. But the Torah also says only from the age of 20. So a boy, a man, in those days, I'm sure he would have been a man by the age of 19, is not included in the census, but surely there will be a certain number who will cross the threshold of the 20th year within that year. Similarly, the census only extended until the age of 60 because the idea was that these are kol yotzei tzava, those who go into the army. And the simple understanding of the reason for this census was to know how many men of fighting age can the Jewish people muster. And that's why they're divided by tribes. And that's why we need the Nesiim, the prince of each tribe, because the prince is going to be responsible for his tribe, both in terms of military purposes. So he wants to know how many fighting men does he have of fighting age, and also equally in terms of because the fight was anticipated to conquer the land of Canaan and then to divvy up the land, because each uh, prince of the tribes, the prince of each tribe has responsibility for the allocation of the land within the homestead of that tribe to the various extended families and households. So he needs to know firstly how many there are. Okay, fair enough. But we have to marvel, why were there no people, or rather, why were the numbers exactly the same? Now, this is not a question of how many or whether they did proliferate in the wilderness, because they only had 1 year in which to proliferate. But it is a question about 19 or 20 years earlier in Mitzrayim. Surely, year by year, the numbers would change. Presumably, the numbers would increase, especially because the Jewish people were on a demographic, it's not so much a roller coaster as a steady ascent from 70 members of the household of Jacob who went down to Egypt 210 years earlier to hundreds of thousands who left that many generations later, which means, as we'll talk about shortly, that they had evidently quite large families. According to rabbinic tradition, maybe even families that were like multiple births at a time. But the point is that year by year, and certainly generation by generation, it would seem that the Jewish people were increasing dramatically in Egypt. And therefore, when they left, we would have thought that a year after they left, the numbers would be different. In any case, even if you put that to one side, how can it be the numbers were exactly the same? So this is the question which Abarbanel asks. So Rashi has an approach in which he says in a kind of technical way that actually they were not counted from the day of birth to establish the 20th year, 20th birthday, but rather it was all according to the Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So therefore, even though it was a year later, but it was effectively the same year. But Ramban refutes that view very convincingly, and Abravanel therefore has to come up with a another explanation to explain how it can be. So he explains why it is, and he has the following suggestion. In our census, in our Sedra, the Torah says clearly, do not count the tribe of Levi within the census of the rest of the Jewish people. I'll just see where it says that. Okay, take my word for it. It says it later on. It says in uh, uh, chapter 2, verse 32. It's on page 736, if you're with me in the Stone Chumash. 603,550. V'haleviim lo haspaktu b'soch b'nei Israel. But the Leviim, the tribe of Levi, were not included among the count of the children of Israel, kashetzu Hashem es Moshe, as God had commanded Moshe. Then it says a few verses later that Moshe was instructed to count the tribe of Levi separately. So says Abravanel, that the explanation for how it can be that the numbers were the same is that the first census, the tribe of Levi was included. The second census, as we've just seen right now, the tribe of Levi was excluded. The reason the tribe of Levi was excluded here is twofold. Firstly, they have a special status, and we're going to consider that shortly. But besides that, they do not have the role of participating in the military endeavor. The tribe of Levi were like it's a very archaic term, the ecclesiastical class. They were the priests and they were the clerics, they were the rabbis, we would say in today's terminology. And they were the spiritual leaders of the Jewish people, and therefore they were absolved from army service. Now, this is very contentious politically in Israel today, especially tonight, is Yom Yerushalayim, and the matter is subject to very strong opinions, and it's threatening to bring down the whole government in Israel yet again. I'm not going down that path, but the fact is that the biblical precedent suggests that those who are responsible for teaching Torah, those who are responsible for the spiritual leadership of the Jewish people, do not participate in the army. Again, I'm not looking to apply that very simplistic formula to explain or to somehow determine the policy of the state of Israel, although it is a factor, I think, to be taken into account, but that's not my intention. My intention is to just observe that they were not part of the army, nor were they part of the process of allocating the land, because each of the 12 tribes, with the possible exception of Shimon, who were kind of dispersed within the southern tribes of Yehuda, who had a very large allocation, but all of the other tribes were given a tract of land, a region within the land of Israel. You could also say maybe Reuven and Gad and part of the tribe of Manasseh were also not located in the land of Israel because they chose to remain in the Transjordan, the eastern bank of the Jordan River. But that was only a further subsequent development, and presumably, initially, the intention, if we can say that Hashem sort of fell back on a plan B, but presumably they were all intended to have their ancestral homestead within the land of Israel, but not Leviim. The Leviim were never given a tract of land. The Leviim were given cities that were positioned within each of the other tribes. There were 48, I think 48, or is it 42? 42, I believe, cities of the Levium, and that is where the Levium lived. They were distributed more or less evenly throughout all the tribes of Israel. They did not have a homestead or a tract of land that they would cultivate because their role was not to work the land. Their role was to cultivate and to strengthen and to provide the example for the relationship between the people and Hashem. And the Levium had that responsibility. So therefore, this is why once the Levium were separated, says Abarbanel, that the first census did not take into account the distinctive role of the Levium. It was only after the sin of the golden calf, when the tribe of Levi was distinguished or designated for this role that we just described, and therefore in the first census, the tribe of Levi was included. So there were 600,000 603,550. I think that was the exact same figure. It's not the exact same. It's very close to the same figure in the earlier census in Shmos in Kisisa. Then the Levium were included. Now the Levium are not included. So although the number seems to be the same, but actually the constituents who were included in the census are not identical because the tribe of Levi, we'll learn more about that shortly, the tribe of Levi was not included now, and they were included previously. So according to Abarbanel, in actuality, the Jewish people did increase in number in the sense that besides the infants who were born during that year, putting that to one side because we're not counting them anyway, only from the age of 20 years. But it means that when they left Mitzrayim, there were 19-year-olds who indeed turned 20. There were probably 59-year-olds who turned 60 or 61, whatever the threshold was as well. But on the whole, the numbers were increasing, but those numbers were offset by the fact that we did not include the 22,000 Levium in this current second census, which we did the first time around. Now, I want to just elaborate a little bit further because Abarbanel says that we read in Pasuk Mem Tes, if you look at on page 730 in verse 49 in chapter 1. Ach esmatei Levi lo sifkod v'esoshom lo sisar. Do not include them. Okay, we found that other post that says that here. It says explicitly, do not include them b'soch b'nei among the children of Israel. Rather, v'ata hafkedes halavim al mishkan ha'idus. But rather, don't count them as like within the wider census of the children of Israel, which, as we said, was for the purpose, at least on the derech hapshat, at the simple level of raising an army for warfare. They have a special role. They are to be designated and dedicated to the service of the Mishkan. Service of the Mishkan means to assemble it, to disassemble it, to maintain it, to transport it, to ensure that it was functioning properly, to repair it as necessary, to be sure that unauthorized people do not enter the precincts of the Mishkan, to assist the Kohanim, also in a wider sense to serve as like a sort of support staff for the Kohanim, also in terms of singing. They would sing, and they had instruments. Later on, they would have instruments as well. I'm not sure whether they had instruments in the Mishkan. It was only later on in the Beis Hamikdash. Perhaps they did. But in any case, the Levium were distinctive, and in a way, they were in a spiritually exalted position, and therefore they were not counted. Abarbanel elaborates a bit. They were legion shel melech. That's the expression Rashi uses. Legion is probably from the Latin word legion, like Roman legionnaires. It's probably the same word. And they were the legion of the Almighty. They were like an honor guard. So they were not necessarily military men. Their role was more of a symbolic. When I said to be sure there's no unauthorized access, I don't think the Levim anticipated a sort of attempt by force to enter the Mishkan. It was more a question of just supervising and providing directions. This is, you can look from here, you may not stand over here. Not that much different than the guards at Buckingham Palace, whose role is more ceremonial, but actually in the language of the rabbis, that a palace with guards is more exalted, it's more dignified than a palace or even a king without guards. The presence of the honor guard is significant, and that was the role of the Levim. But that was only designated later on, only at this point. Previously, they were included among the count of Bnei Israel. And I want to just share with you a little bit further what Abarbanel also says here, that this is an echo of Har Sinai. Ramban says, Abarbanel doesn't draw attention to this, but Ramban says that the Mishkan was a kind of portable Har Sinai, in the sense, and I mentioned it a few minutes ago when we first began, that just as Moshe communed with God on Mount Sinai, subsequently Moshe would commune with Hashem in the Mishkan. And it was a portable Har Sinai because they took it with them when in the course of their travels. Says Abarbanel that we find that when Hashem was preparing the people for the giving of the Torah, so he indicated that the mountain should be cordoned off, whether literally or just figuratively, that there should be a distance that the people need to keep from the mountain, Pen yaharsu lir'os v'nafalmu min orav, lest they break through and they gaze at the Shechina, and they many may perish as a result. So the Torah specifically says about Har Sinai. Of course, we're approaching Shavuos, so it's nice to have something on Matan Torah. Actually, a week from tonight is Shavuos, and therefore we're not going to have this year next Thursday night. So it's nice to say something about Shavuos now as well, with the giving of the Torah. So the Torah describes how Har Sinai was designated and separated, and there was a response. The Torah indicates that the nobility at this time, it may have been the Bechorim, the firstborn, or there would have been like a stratum of distinguished members of the Jewish people, some of whom are identified by name, like Aaron, like Yoshua, like Hur, and of course the others we don't know them by name. Nadav and Avihu were among them as well, and no doubt others as well, who were authorized to get closer to Har Sinai and to keep everyone else at a distance, but even they did not ascend to Har Sinai, only Moshe did. So similarly, by way of corresponding to that, the Mishkan, which also represents the medium for divine revelation, was sort of protected by the Levim, and that was a role of distinction. And similarly, we find at the very end of the Sedra, again, if you've got your Chumash, we're making good use of it today. We don't always, but today we shall. Take a look at the very, very end of the Sedra. In the art scroll, it's on page 746, but whatever Chumash you're using, the very last words of the whole Sedra, the Torah describes how the Levim are responsible for dismantling the Mishkan, and especially the holiest vessels, protecting them, covering them, to transport them. And they had to be very cautious because they were not allowed even to gaze at them. And it says, for the very last pasuk, "V'lo yavo'u liros kivala es hakodesh v'meisu." They shall not come to look as the holy is inserted, lest they die, because the holy objects, the holy accoutrements of the Aron, etc., they were wrapped in a protective fabric, and the protection was not only from the elements, so it won't be dented or damaged in transit, but it was also they were not allowed to gaze upon it either. Even that was restricted, and that is like Har Sinai, where like we mentioned that passage just now, liros v'mesu, lest the people gaze at the Shechina, where the people could see the Shechina only from a distance, and even that overwhelmed them, and even that they could only endure the first two of the Ten Commandments that were articulated, if we can use that word, by Hashem, whether the people perceived the voice of God. It overwhelmed them, and they said to Moshe, we can't take anymore. According to rabbinic tradition, their souls left them and they were resurrected. So if anyone had gazed, if anyone had trailed behind Moshe and climbed halfway up the mountain, he definitely would have perished. And in a similar way, the Leviim, part of their role was, and part of the caution was, not to look where they should not be looking. And again, that's a way of personifying or exemplifying the sanctity and the holiness of the divine revelation. And I would say by extension, we do find even to this very day the notion that some aspects of Torah thought or Torah wisdom are esoteric, are what we would say today Kabbalistic. They have a mystical, maybe a profound meaning, and maybe a potency that makes it dangerous for a person to dabble in it if he, maybe she, I don't know if the she is supposed to do it all together. I wouldn't want to say one way or the other, but if he's unsuited and undeserving or unworthy. And much has been written about that, but we do find still an echo of that concept even nowadays. I just want to add on, though, before we get to the second thing I want to share with you, that after Matan Torah, it says clearly, Bimshoch Hayovel Hema Ya'alu Bahar, that after the shofar was sounded at the end of the giving of the Torah, then they're allowed to climb the mountain. Now, at the simple level, it means that the sanctity and the special role of Har Sinai has lapsed, and anyone can climb. I even climbed it myself many years ago. I think my sister Shira is here. She may have climbed it with me as well. We were kids then. Whether it really is Har Sinai, we don't know for sure. It could have been. The Arabs call it Jebel Musa. Could be it is Har Sinai. Anyway, we climbed it many years ago. So anybody can. Um, uh, Politically, it may be more problematic now. In those years, in 1972, it was under the Israeli administration uh, after the Six-Day War. So Yom Yerushalayim, so we can recall those dramatic events. And there were a few short years between 1967 and 1973 when it was the Yom Kippur War, when it was in Israeli administration. And anyway, that's when we climbed Har Sinai. In any case, what I want to say is that the Levium had the role of regulating or restricting access to the Mishkan and later on to the temple in Yerushalayim. Only those in a state of purity are allowed to enter. By the way, that is men and women. There was a space for women as well, women and men and Israelites. Even, by the way, Gentiles were allowed to attend even as well, but only certain places. And those who are the Kohanim, of course, were allowed to enter into the more restricted place. But my point is that the Levium in the era that we're discussing, they were regulating the access, but subsequently the Levium, symbolizing the teachers of Torah, their role subsequently, even to this day, is to encourage people to study Torah, not to sort of say, well, this you can study, this you can't, but rather, on the whole, they are the ones who are the teachers of Torah, and the fact that they did not have their own homestead in the land of Israel was in order so that they would be dispersed throughout the land of Israel, and so that every tribe, the tribe of Gad and the tribe of Asher and the tribe of Reuven, all of the tribes, maybe a bit less Reuven and Gad because they were in the Ever HaYarden, but the point is that they would all have access to the Levium. So the Levium were not supposed to be limited to a certain place. On the contrary, they were diffuse throughout the land of Israel so that the example that they can set and the teaching they can provide and the wisdom that they can impart would be accessible to all. And that remains the case even to this very day, in which every community and every, let's say, a group of people hopefully have access to teachers and to exemplars, those who can personify the Torah, those who can teach the Torah, etc. We have a few minutes left, and I want to take up another question, which is also very intriguing. You may have heard me mention that the number of Levium, which the Torah mentions here, is 22,000. Maybe 22,300 because there were maybe 300 Bechoros. Let's say 22,000 as a schum agol. Quite a few people, 22,000. But if you think about the math, even for a moment, we'll realize it's a very small number. Because if there were, again, just using round numbers, if there were 600,000 Jews and there were 12 tribes, so that's approximately 50,000 per tribe. If it's 50,000 per tribe, why were the Levium only 22,000? They were less than half of the next smallest tribe. Not only that, but the Levium were counted from the age of 30 days. All of the tribes of Israel from the age of 20 years, and we said, why? Because they're supposed to go out to war. The Levium are not going out to war. They have a special role, a special status. They were counted in the census from the age of 1 month, 30 days. So it's very surprising that of all of the Levium, from the age of 30 days, we only find 22,000. It's much less than we would expect. Besides which, the Abarbanel adds that from the age of 30 to 50, we find 8,000, or at least, yeah, I think between the age of 30 and 50, because they only worked from the age of 30. For 10 years, they had the training and like apprenticeship, and the working career of the Levim was 20 years from the age 30 to age 50. So of those who were fit to serve in the Mishkan and to serve in the role, as we said, of transporting, dismantling, etc., the Mishkan, there were 8,000. So we don't know exactly how many Levium from the age of 20 years and up because we don't have a census of them. So we can't compare exactly like for like, but we definitely get a feel that there were 22,000 from the age of 30 days. There were 8,000 from the age of 30 to 50. So this is very odd. Why were there so few Levium, to put it very simply? So Ramban has a beautiful answer, but Abarbanel is not impressed with it, or doesn't. He says it's derech drash. I'll just mention very brief because it's a very beautiful answer. Perhaps you've come across it as well. Uh, Ramban says that the Jewish people increased from 70 to 600,000. How is it possible? Well, if you do the mathematics, actually, it is possible with quite large families. Okay, quite large families. According to Chazal, they may have been like supernaturally large women giving birth to sextuplets every time. But the point is that evidently the blessing of increase, the blessing of fecundity was enormous. And so, although the Jews were oppressed, but they proliferated. That's explicit in the well-known pasuk, "Kasher ya'anu also ken yiber v'chen yifrotz." According to the persecution and the oppression, the Jewish people increased and spread. And therefore, as a result, there were hundreds of thousands who left 210 years later. Says Ramban that the blessing of increase was in accordance with the suffering and the oppression. Because the Jewish people collectively were enslaved, Hashem blessed them with increase. It's like we say, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, or the tough go shopping. But in the example of the blessing of Mitzrayim, those who were oppressed, they had the blessing of increase. The Levium were not enslaved, although they were not free to leave, but they were not enslaved according to Chazal. According to our tradition, the Levium were never enslaved. Since they were never enslaved, therefore their numbers did not increase. That's what Ramban says. Says Abarbanel, this is derech drash. He has another suggestion. He says that the reason they did not increase is that the Jewish people were blessed with great increase because when Yaakov descended to Mitzrayim, he and his household 70 souls. Again, it may not include all of the women or the daughters-in-law or the granddaughters, but that's the number we work with, 70. Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were each promised your descendants will inherit the land. Wonderful. But in order to conquer the land, in order to settle the land, in order to live in the land of Israel and to defend it, you need big numbers. You can't do it with 10,000 or 20,000 people. So says Abarbanel that Hashem blessed the Jewish people with increase so that they would have sufficient numbers to raise an army, to conquer the land, and to settle the land. If they are not able to settle the land, if they're more wild animals than people to remove the rocks and to sort of till and render the land productive, then it won't work, al derech hapsha, al derech hateva, according to natural means. So therefore, there was a need for a lot of Jews. So therefore, we have 600,000 Jews. What about the Levium? So we said already that the Levium were not included in the army. The Levium were not included in the working the land. They were not included in getting an allocation of a homestead in any particular part of the land of Israel. They just lived in cities. They were urban dwellers throughout the land of Israel. Moreover, and here I like this because Abarbanel, was the minister of finance to Ferdinand and Isabella. He was a businessman. He was in the statesman. He was in high levels, the highest echelon of government. He understood a lot about taxation. And he says that if there were a lot of Levium, who supports the Levium? The tzibur, the community. He says if the Levium were numerous, then it would be that much more of a financial burden on the rest of the Jewish people to support the Levium. So therefore the Levium were small in number. 22,000 is about 3%. It's about 3% of the 600,000, roughly. Slightly more. Let's say 3%. And therefore, the rest of the Jewish people collectively were able to provide for the financial wherewithal and the means of support for 3% of the population. Just by way of, I was curious about investigating it. Firstly, the Levium today proportion to the Jewish people collectively worldwide is estimated between 3 and 4%. Kohanim, similarly, 3 and 4%. Now, in biblical times, certainly in the generation we're talking about now, the Kohanim were one family, the Leviim were 22,000. So there was definitely a big, big differential because Aaron was the only Kohen Gadol. His children were the Kohanim. But okay, we can talk about that separately. It's not for now. But over the many centuries and millennia, the numbers of Kohanim have increased relative to Leviim. So the numbers of Leviim and Kohanim in the Jewish world today are roughly similar, about 3 to 4% each. Which means that collectively, the tribe of Levi today is, let's say, between 6 and 8% of the Jewish people. And in early antiquity, it was about 3%. Okay, it's not surprising that the proportions have changed. Again, that's not at all surprising. My point is that a reasonable proportion of people and families, let's say, to be supported by the public purse? I think it's not unreasonable at all, because in the United Kingdom today, the civil servants make up 1% of the population. 1% of the working population in the United Kingdom are civil servants. 1%. But the percentage of those in the public sector is 10%. So they're 10% working in the public sector, which means that you and I are supporting 10%. I'm not saying they're loafers. They're definitely contributing and they're making the society function. But their support comes from the taxpayer. How much tax? What's the tax burden in the United Kingdom? Again, Rabbi Google, Dr. Google, Professor Google says 37%. The whole economy as a whole, 37% is the tax burden. So the UK public is handing over 37% of economic productivity to taxation, and we're supporting 10% in the public sector, of which 1% are the civil servants. So in ancient Israel, where the Levium and the Maaser was a tenth, and there are certain other gifts that were also given, was much less. The tax burden, if you like, was much less than it is in the United Kingdom today and in other Western countries today. America, it's a bit less. Some countries, it's a bit more. But the point is that this analysis, which, again, you'll forgive me for giving a bit of contemporary context of Abarbanel, I think is very astute, very compelling, and it's tsukapast for someone who was a minister of finance. So he says that this may be why. Of course, it was min hashamayim. It wasn't just happenstance that those some were more fertile and other women were less so. He says this was the divine intent that the Jewish people should increase dramatically in Mitzrayim for the reason that we've said, but the Levium should not increase that much. Firstly, they were not part of the campaign to conquer the land of Israel and to settle the land of Israel, but moreover, more importantly, he says that they were only of let's say, a more limited burden on the public purse, because if there had been tens of thousands more Levium, then that would be that much more of a financial obligation on the rest of the tzibur. And this is why he suggests the Shevet Levi was smaller than the other Shvatim. And again, he does mention Ramban's suggestion. He says Ramban is derech drash, and he suggests this al derech hapshat, although it also does take into account the divine providence that ensured that the numbers would be as the Torah describes. Okay, thank you very much. I wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos and a wonderful Yom Tov. I don't think we'll meet in this context on Thursday night unless you come to Kesher, which I hope you will. But if you don't, we won't be on the Zoom next Thursday night. Mirz Hashem, 2 weeks' time, we'll be back at it. I wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos and a wonderful Yom Tov. Chag Sameach.